All right, guys, the first thing I do want to say is we do have a few more openings for my fantasy football leagues. We're going to be drafting pretty soon. If you are interested, DM me on Twitter or you can email me. My email will be in the description. We've got a few spots left. Can't even give these spots away at this point, but hopefully we can get those filled. We do have a very interesting college football realignment story to get to. It ponders the idea of what a possible third super conference would look like. And as you can see, it says realignment is trending towards a Power 2, the Big Ten and SEC. What if the other three leagues pooled their top schools to make the best of the rest conference? It might look like this. I guess the first thing I want to say is I don't think this is going to happen. I think the ACC, at least at this point, it looks like it will survive for the time being, along with obviously the Big 12, which would be 4 conferences overall. But certainly the way college football is structured, you have a Power 2 and then everyone else, maybe teams want to come together and who would be, the most lucrative teams and possibly joining and forming a actual third super conference. Some of the rules here, it says we are going to presume Notre Dame either stays independent or ends up in the Big Ten, and they're not a candidate. So again, remember, they're trying to pick the best schools, not in the Big Ten, not in the SEC, and not Notre Dame. Because it would be very easy to pick Notre Dame, but there's no reason Notre Dame would join a third. Guys, let me just say this right here. If Notre Dame is joining a conference, it's the Big Ten. So Notre Dame has 2 options after its TV deal runs out. Join the Big Ten or be an independent. They're not going to the SEC. They're not going to a third super conference. They're joining the Big Ten or they're remaining an independent. And based on all the recent intel we've heard, they will be remaining an independent, but the money might be too big. We will see what they end up doing. And these are overall the conferences. It says the biggest presumption here is that the ACC teams could somehow be freed from their grant of rights bondage that extends midway through the 2030s, 2036 to be exact. It might take more than half the current 14 members to unify a legal fight. Actually, it takes 8. So yes, the simple majority, 8 members, and maybe Notre Dame. There was a report that Notre Dame could also help and count as one of the schools that could vote to be freed from the ACC. So we will see. Again, that whole situation, there has to be 8 schools where it makes sense for them to leave the ACC, meaning we know, if the ACC is going to get blown up, the SEC is going to be taking schools, but can it get to 8 teams total? Because Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, those 4 schools most certainly will vote to get out of the grant of rights, but some of the other schools, it's not going to make sense blowing up the ACC because there's going to be no spot for them in the Big Ten or the SEC unless the Big Ten extends to 24 teams. And then these are all of the teams. So this article, the way it was written, I just think it was written poorly. I don't know. It's just they don't have a list of it. They don't have a list. So I'm just going to read it off. So the first team is North Carolina that would be in this conference. Obviously, we know North Carolina is wanted by both the Big Ten and the SEC if either of those conferences want to expand. The SEC right now, they say they're staying at 16, but in the event the SEC expands, they would want North Carolina. In the event the Big Ten expands, well, they would want a West Wing, but even still, the reality is North Carolina is a very valuable school. So this conference would be North Carolina, Clemson, Florida State, Miami, Oregon, Washington, Baylor, TCU, Stanford, California, Oklahoma State, Virginia, Utah, Arizona State, Cincinnati, UCF, and then either West Virginia or Pittsburgh to make up a third massive super conference. And you would figure this would be an amazing thing for many of these teams like Virginia, Utah, Oklahoma State, California and Stanford, I'm sure, want to get into the Big Ten. We'll see if that works out. But like Baylor, because you would have to figure some of these teams that would be leaving the Big 12, because this is the third super conference that combines the best of the rest. It combines the best ACC, the best Big 12, the best Pac-12 teams that are remaining. And the idea is, the TV deal would be phenomenal compared to what the Big 12 currently is getting. The Big 12 has a major hurdle of really not having any major teams in the conference. So if you're Baylor, TCU, and you get into a conference that has Washington, Oregon, Florida State, Clemson, this is a very interesting idea. It really is, because it makes sense for the top schools. Obviously Florida State would probably go to the SEC or the Big Ten. Florida State, apparently, I talked about it yesterday, their academics are getting up. They're trying to be an AAU member. They really want to get into the Big Ten. But either way, this could be something that could be very beneficial for the overall balance of college football. The idea, instead of having this weird kind of, I've called it a super conference. It's really not. But like the Big 12 getting to 16 teams, it's not a super conference. The only reason you would call it a super conference is because it has 16 teams. The problem is there's no great programs, and that's going to kill their TV deal. The amount of money they can get, from ESPN, they don't have the ratings kings. With this potential third conference, you've got North Carolina, amazing in basketball, great academics, good enough in football. Clemson, football powerhouse. Florida State. You can say what you want, but they're still a football powerhouse, and I think they're going to get better. Miami is on the rise. Oregon, Washington. You're adding some West Coast schools. Stanford and Cal. The only way I would say this is not realistic is because I do believe Oregon and Washington are headed to the Big Ten. It's been publicized. The Big Ten wants to get to at least 20 teams, and I think it's going to be Oregon, Washington, Stanford, and California in the event Notre Dame wants to remain an independent. I really don't have a prediction right now on Notre Dame because I think it could go either way by the time their TV contract is up with NBC at the end of 2024. That is strictly a money versus prestige thing, because Notre Dame has this prestige where they love being an independent and everything like that. And theoretically, with the 12-team playoff coming into effect probably in 2024, being an independent's going to be even easier because you could still lose games. You don't need that 13th data point to get into the playoff. So this conference, the teams that would be, making bank, Oklahoma State would be winning the lottery joining this conference. The TV deal would be probably double what they're going to get for the Big 12. Virginia, you get academics. Utah. Utah is in a position right now where it's looking like Utah's probably going to join the Big 12 in the event the Pac-12 gets nuked. You're winning the lottery if a third mega conference like this gets created. And this was actually one of the theories that happened right after the news broke of USC and UCLA. It was this idea that there's still teams that have significant value. Why don't those teams, you see the Big Two, the SEC and the Big Ten, why don't those teams just band together and say, you know what? We could just, instead of doing this thing where it's the ACC and it's Clemson begging ESPN to get a better deal so they can up their money and get unequal revenue sharing, the Big 12, hanging on, whatever. Why not all the best teams that aren't already in the SEC and the Big 10, why don't they just form their own conference? It's all about money anyways. Geographics, the geography of it does not matter. We've got California teams joining the Big Ten. We're going to have in-conference games where UCLA travels to Rutgers. That's an in-conference game now. So what does it matter? Just get as much money as you possibly can. Unfortunately, you would have teams that would get trampled in this scenario. Teams in the Big 12 that aren't good enough to get into a conference like this. Teams like Boston College, Wake Forest in the Big 12. It is surprising that Kansas is not in here. I do not think Kansas is in this possible league. So once again, I'll read. Well, no, I'm not going to read it off again. But you guys can. It's an SI article, and I just think it was poorly written. But either way, we'll see if something like this does end up happening. And then I wanted to show you guys a tier list. Well, this isn't a tier list. This is just a mock possible conference, situation. The end all be all. And this was sent to me via Twitter. As you can see, this is the SEC with 20 teams, adding the 4 teams that we thought. Clemson, Miami, North Carolina, and Florida State. So they've got 20 teams. This is the Big Ten with 20 teams. They are adding Notre Dame. They're adding Washington. They're adding Oregon. And they are adding Stanford. So, and that could certainly happen if Notre Dame, because that's the whole thing. If Notre Dame is joining, I think the team that Notre Dame joins with is Stanford, not California. The only way California gets into the Big Ten is if Notre Dame says, no, we're staying an independent. At that point, it would be Stanford and California. This has the Big 12 staying alive and I believe expanding to 16 teams, the 4 schools that were rumored. So this certainly could happen. You've got Utah, you've got Arizona, you've got Arizona State, and then you also have Colorado. So very realistic. This has the ACC staying alive as a conference, but getting severely depleted, and then adding several teams like Army, Temple, South Florida, who apparently has an amazing market, South Florida does, Memphis, Navy. So they basically, the ACC in this scenario is basically a group of 5 conference, and then the Pac-12 is just completely nuked. You're taking on Boise State, you've got San Diego State, you get SMU, Utah State, San Jose State, Hawaii. Hawaii is a dead program right now. Rice. So yeah, the Pac-12 gets crushed. But this person's theory is that no conference is going to dissolve. Even if a conference like the Pac-12 gets crushed, it will still survive, at least to some degree. And I think this is a realistic scenario. If every conference survives, this is what the conferences overall could look like. And obviously, the ACC severely weakens, losing those 4 major teams. The Pac-12 gets destroyed. The Big 12, kind of what we expected. They go to 16 teams, taking the 4 schools from the Pac-12. The Big 10 gets Notre Dame, and then the 3 schools from the Pac-12. And the SEC snatches 4 schools from the ACC. Of course, the one thing I would say that hurts this theory is the ACC's grant of rights. The idea is you would need 8 teams to have landing spots outside of the ACC that make sense, meaning it's not just finding landing spots for Clemson, Florida State, Miami, and teams like that. You would need to find landing spots for at least 8 schools, so possibly Louisville. I do think Louisville is a good fit in the SEC, and I know they have money. Maybe NC State, maybe Pittsburgh to the Big Ten, Virginia possibly in the Big Ten, and that whole idea hinges on, also talks about the Big Ten possibly expanding to 24 teams, which I think would have to happen. The idea that the Big 12 can take teams from the ACC, to me, is not realistic because there's no incentive. Once again, the Big 12's major issue is the lack of major blue blood universities, which is going to hinder their chances at getting a really good TV deal. And if they would have got, if the Big 12 somehow lands an amazing TV deal that's better than the ACC's, you could coax teams to leave the ACC for the Big 12. The problem is they're not going to get a good deal. So why would those teams leave the ACC? That's my theory on it. But still, this is a variant. Maybe you could find some loophole in the grant of rights to get out of it. But you would theoretically need 8 teams to have landing spots outside of the ACC. So then those 8 teams vote to dissolve the conference. It's a simple majority, and the conference is, in that case, dissolved, and they are free to leave the conference with no exit fee. But guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for watching.